In a world where trauma is real, where people seek out distraction from their internal lives and relationships with others, and where no one is taught healthy self-care, help was needed. In 2019, the mission began. Find a way to help people understand and better their mental health. Seek out ways to explore relationships and how they work. Fight against the stigmas that surround counseling and therapy. And, most importantly,
do all of that so you don't have to be a therapist to understand it. Hey everybody, welcome to Season 2 of Therapist Theater. I'm your host, Josh Treese. I'm a practicing therapist in Music City, USA, and every week a guest therapist, counselor, or social worker joins me here in the theater to talk about a movie that we've seen and what relationships or mental health issues it highlights. This week's guest is LanJericha Finch. She's a licensed professional counselor here in Nashville who's worked in the mental health field for the past 10 years. She specializes in working with clients struggling with substance abuse, trauma, and relationship issues. Thanks so much for downloading today's show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And while you're doing that, help other people find the show by giving it a 5-star rating and writing a review for it in the podcast app. I don't need your help. I have got myself. I know how this goes. Once all the talking is through, people just go back to their own nonsenses. I know that, so don't worry about me. I will dim the lights, raise the curtain, and start the previews. Welcome to the theater.
Jericha, hi. It is so great to have you on and get a chance to meet you today.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am just so excited. So I typically like to start every interview by asking my guest why therapy. But we were talking before we started recording, and I have found that I tend to ask this question anyway. So I thought that I would make it kind of a more formal, structured part of the interview. And so what I'd love to ask you is, before you became a therapist, did you have some idea in your head, some conception of what a therapist was, what they did, or what therapy was?
I did. So the first time I participated in therapy was at the age of 15. So I was pretty young the first time that I saw a therapist. Prior to that, I think I had the idea that most people have, which is you see someone laying on the couch, they're able to kind of walk into a space and just have someone listen to their problems, which seems like a pretty amazing thing to me, even at the age of 15. And so I was super excited. It was obviously different than what I saw on TV prior to that experience. But yeah, my idea was that it was just a safe, confidential space to be able to go and talk about your stuff.
And you thought that when you were 15?
I did.
That's such like a mature conception of what it is. Because I say that because I think, sometime around that time, I had a couple of people say to me, my parents were getting divorced at that time. And I had somebody say to me, maybe you should go and talk to somebody. And I think that, maybe it was just my teenage maleness of it, but I think that I took that more as like an insult.
Mm.
And so I think that the idea that I had at that time was, oh, well, therapists help crazy people or therapists help broken people. And I didn't want to think that I was crazy or broken.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think for me, things were so chaotic and crazy at home that I craved a space to be able to go and talk about what was happening because I couldn't
Yeah.
share it anywhere else. So yeah, I was kind of forced into the therapy situation, but when
Okay.
I was super excited about it, and it was all the things I thought it would be.
Nice. Well, I was going to ask you that too. Did somebody help you to um, understand that that's what therapy was? Because I think for me, other than what I saw on TV, therapy was nowhere. It didn't touch anywhere in my world, or it didn't touch anybody in my world. So I didn't have somebody who could have said, here's what therapy is. Would you consider going? All I knew was what I saw, with Fraser Crane or
Yeah.
I always struggle to think of somebody else when I was in my teens that provided a picture of what a therapist was, but he's always who I pull out because it's the only one I can think of.
Yeah. Not necessarily therapy per se. We talked about mental health. My mom and I, she struggled with depression throughout my whole childhood.
Hmm.
And so I know that she was getting medication to help her manage that. And so I think to some degree that kind of normalized just mental health treatment in general for me. Um,
So your
where
mom had some experience with going to therapy?
She did. And not that we even talked about it. She didn't share that with me until I was an adult, but I knew that she was getting some kind of treatment, even though it wasn't therapy, for her mental health issues, which kind of just helped me to understand that it was okay to seek help for that kind of thing. And so, yeah, I didn't actually find out that she participated in therapy until I was an adult, but I knew that she was doing the medication management piece.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, no, not really anyone in my world who was like, yeah, therapy's awesome. Go do that. But it just seemed pretty awesome to me at the time.
Okay. So why therapy? Why do you do what you do now?
Well, I attribute most of it to that experience of going to therapy when I was 15. Honestly, I, um, yeah, so I grew up, so I'm an adult child of an alcoholic, and that experience can be very traumatic. And so when I went in, and I literally only went and saw that therapist, I think twice, um, for a number of reasons, but went and saw her and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then the next year in high school, I took a psychology class, which isn't something that's always offered in high school,
Is
but
it AP?
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I took that too.
Yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is a reinforced, like, this is amazing. And so when I went to college, I actually thought that I originally started out as pre-law and then decided that I was just like fighting what I already knew to be true, which was that I was like created to help people in this capacity. So yeah, I think that my childhood experiences, therapy helping me at a very young age and giving me a sense of safety were the main reasons why I decided to take this route and be a therapist.
Yeah. Since becoming a therapist, tell me about like your idea of therapy ahead of time versus what you experience it as now. Do those feel similar? Do they feel different? Have you been able to add to it?
Yeah, I think it's different. I think originally I thought of it as a very kind of formal deal, where you're coming in and there's this person that's, listening, assessing, diagnosing, and then like giving you the solution to your problems, and I found out my mentor in grad school. I remember doing practicum work or like recording sessions, and they're analyzing everything that you're doing. And she just said, I just want you to go in. I just want you to have a conversation. And I always share that because that helped shift the whole way I thought about therapy and how I interacted with my clients.
Hmm.
And so now, yeah, we're going in, we're having a conversation. I'm getting to know you. I get to show up in the room, not as the expert, right? But as someone who's trying to get to know you and helping you get to a place where you create your own insight and figure out how you want to navigate and move through the rest of your life. So yeah, it's definitely different. It feels more relaxed. It feels, it's still intentional, but it's not stuffy. And it's you're building a connection rather than someone coming in and just telling you this is what you need to do. So I enjoy it more, and I'm glad I had that experience to help me shift the way I saw therapy in general.
Do you think that, you mentioned less formal?
Yeah.
Do you think that was maybe remnants of you being in the client role that you were kind of still hanging on to, that kind of made it feel a little formal at first?
Maybe so. Yeah. I think I've always been someone who kind of over analyzes things. So
A therapist? Really?
right. As a client, I tend to overanalyze things from the perspective of, what I should share and in what way and how do I convey what I need to say. And, I think the same is true for, a novice therapist, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just think the more comfortable I became with what I was doing and seeing that, therapy really does work, I just didn't feel the need to have to make that so formal. It just seemed to help people. People want to come in and it's like, oh, it's so much less intimidating, to someone to come in and be like, we're just going to have a conversation today and get to know each other a little bit better.
Yeah.
Rather than going down your checklist,
Yeah. And I think that this is such an interesting job, because I think we as therapists become more, we introduce more of ourselves into the room as time goes on, or at least I shouldn't say we, that might be me projecting, I don't know, but that's my experience in doing it. I know that when I first started seeing clients during my practicum, I was scared to even make a joke.
Yeah.
Because I just thought, I've got to be this, pillar of sincerity, and I gotta, make sure that it was this idea that Josh couldn't be a therapist. Like, I had to put my Josh hat down at the door and pick up my therapist hat.
Yeah.
And then what I've continued to discover is that is leaving one of the biggest, tools in my tool bag outside the room. Leaving me outside the room reduces my ability to be present and reduces my ability to connect with people.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And you're right. We're taught, it's like, am I reflecting? Am I, what's my body language saying? Do I have posture? It's all of those things that don't self-disclose, all of those things that are, kind of instilled early on, I think, to just ensure that we, are learning the basic skills of being a therapist. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The biggest change agent, I think, is being able to show up fully in the room with the person sitting across from you.
Yeah.
And, I find that clients really appreciate that, and they find it inspiring to know that we're just people too, and we've had our own journeys of healing and continue to do that. And, it's not a bad thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I agree.
You mentioned in your kind of journey to therapy that you had started out pre-law until you kind of discovered that you were fighting against what you kind of knew instinctually.
Yeah.
Tell me about that a little bit more. Like, were you thinking maybe therapy before you even started the pre-law, or was it kind of just a constant uncovering and kind of going, oh, maybe it's something different, kind of?
No, yeah, I was always thinking about it. I think for a long time prior to me being 15, I think it made sense. You have parents that are reinforcing that this would be being an attorney would be a good trade for me. It would be a good fit. I was always interested in that mock trial, the law, all the things. I was always interested in that. But even as I sat down with my mom and had to identify a major during my orientation, when I marked pre-law, it didn't really sit well with me. It just felt like something that I was doing because I felt like it was going to be a more stable career. And I very quickly shifted to, having to be okay with learning that it was more important to choose something that I was super passionate about.
Yeah.
Trusting that, things would work out.
So it felt like a I should rather than an I want.
Yes, for sure.
I get that. Yeah. When I was in grad school, our ethics teacher brought in a guest speaker one time who was I want to say he was an LPC as well as an attorney. And so he came in to speak about kind of the legal implications of ethics and stuff. And I remember thinking at that time, how did you have the time to get these degrees? Do you have the same amount of hours in your day that I do in mine? Because I'm struggling to get this one master's degree, and you're over there. You got a bunch of them. Sheesh.
Yeah.
Yeah, our ethics teacher had said at the beginning of the class, hi, you're in ethics now, which means you're almost done with your degree. So my job is to scare you into taking this seriously. So let's talk about ethics.
That's good timing. They didn't do that in our program, but yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about a movie.
Okay, yeah.
What movie did you bring for us to talk about today?
August, Osage County.
August, Osage County.
I chose. Yeah.
Yeah. So I said to my wife, so I watched this movie this morning.
Okay. Oh, okay. It's fresh. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I watched it this morning, and after it was over, I told my wife a little bit about it. Here's what it was about, and then I said, I'm gonna tell my guests from now on that we can only do happy movies. That's gonna be my new rule. And I'm obviously joking, but she was like, well, maybe you could just ask him to give you a heads up if it's an intense one. But this was a really, really good movie. I don't think I remember hearing much about it when it came out, though. I think I remember seeing a trailer or something, but with the cast, it just has tons of heavy hitters in it.
Yeah. So I have this thing where I do I create a list of all the Oscar winning movies a year, and I just go through and watch them all, because you really don't see them advertised in the same way you do more commercial films. And so that's how I, even knew about it in the first place. And I literally had only seen this movie one other time, which was the year that it came out. And immediately when you asked me to come on the show, it was the first movie that came to mind for me.
Really? Nice. Yeah. Have you ever done that thing where I think I know AMC does it, maybe Regal does too, where they show all of the Best Picture nominees over 2 days? Have you ever gone to that?
No.
Yeah, they do amazing. It. Yeah, they do it every year. They probably aren't doing it this year. But it'll be a Saturday and a Sunday, I think. And I think the tickets are $40 a day. And they show 4 movies one day and 4 movies the next. And you just stay in the theater the whole day and watch them. Yeah. And you get a lanyard and some swag or something. I've always wanted to go, but something always comes up to where I can't.
I'll be doing that this year for sure.
Oh yeah. I've always wanted to. Yeah. So lots of heavy hitters. And it's interesting to hear you say, because this movie's 7 years old.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to hear you say, Josh, as soon as you asked me, I knew. This popped in my head and I knew. So what was it about this movie that made you want to pick it?
I think a couple of things. I think one is addiction, right? Very a lot about addiction. You see how addiction can show up in a family. I'm someone who comes from, right, a family where addiction was an issue. I work in the addiction field, have for most of my career. So I tend to gravitate towards those types of films anyway. I think the other part is just the family dynamics piece. So I tend to, I mean, I think a lot of therapy is working on relationships, right? But that tends to be the most enjoyable part of therapy for me, is looking at and working to improve family dynamics and relationships, boundaries and communication, and all the things that were not done very well by this family. And yeah, I mean, I saw it and I just remember thinking like it was heavy, but it was also like, man, there's so much good material in this.
Yeah.
So many different dynamics and issues, and and so it's just, I don't know, it's like a gold mine of like stuff to talk about. Like we could talk about that for hours,
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I was thinking the whole time, this would have been so interesting to watch as a part of our family systems class.
Yeah.
Because you have a family where all of the children are adults who pretty much have their own families.
Yeah.
And so you have that kind of genogram, different generations displayed really at one point kind of all around the same table.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, tell me more. So, I mean, it starts out with what I thought was narration, but was really, I guess, the dad or granddad, depending upon what seat you're sitting in, Beverly, which, so I'm from South Carolina.
Oh, okay.
And whenever my wife and I were getting married, we had to fill out, invitations to send to people. And one of my wife's mom's friends, yes, her name was Deb, and her husband, and wedding invites, you got to do the formal way.
Yeah. So
you got to list everybody's whole name and all that. But her husband's name was Beverly, and I remember at that time asking for correction, because I was like, wait, this is her husband?
Right.
Yes. Just, and that's not like a judgment, but that's just I had never heard of that as a male name before. And then I think my wife's mom was like, yeah, it's an old, Southern, kind of male name. And this is only the second time I've ever heard it, but
this was the first for me.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard others, Leslie. I have a cousin who's a guy named Ashley, but never heard Beverly before. But the movie starts with him hiring a caregiver, housekeeper, kind of both.
Yeah, I think a caregiver shielded as a housekeeper, maybe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But he's kind of setting up, I guess, a little bit of the dynamic that she's going to enter into.
Yeah.
And then we just start meeting folks. And I guess the first of which would be Violet, who's the mom or the grandmom, the matriarch of the family.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think, do we learn right away that she has cancer? Well, I guess so, because he's hiring the caregiver.
Yeah. I think he mentioned initially that she's always, struggled with addiction, but then segued into, her having the cancer, right? Which is, and I think she was having a conversation with Ivy, maybe her daughter, when she was talking about her mouth hurting, and we were really able to kind of gain some insight on that issue, which of course just her, I think her daughter mentioned, like, justified her, substance use at that point.
Yeah.
Had always been an issue.
So then after that, I guess let's call it an inciting incident kind of happens where where Beverly disappears, and all of the daughters start to come in.
Yeah.
I guess Ivy, being what I think is the middle daughter, she, I guess, is already there.
Yes.
But Barbara and Karen, yeah,
Karen. Yeah.
come in from out of town, as well as Ivy or Violet's sister. Oh man, Maddie Faye.
Yeah, Maddie Faye.
By the way, I got IMDb open to look at all these character names because I was
okay.
like,
I wrote them all down.
Yeah, so I was like, there's no way I'm going to remember all these. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we find out in a little bit that Beverly, they had kind of said, because we learned that he's a writer, I think, or a poet or something like that. But they had said, well, he's probably somewhere. He grabbed a fishing boat and some books and some beers, and he's probably somewhere just relaxing to get away. But we find out that he killed himself.
Right.
And so then the rest of the family starts coming in, and it's this story of the family, I guess, attempting to grieve together while also attempting to exist together.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting because, when Barb comes into town, Julia Roberts' character, they actually don't know that he's killed himself, right? So she rushes in just because she believes that her father is out and missing, even though she rarely comes home. And her mom, mentions how, even though she was diagnosed with cancer, Barb never came home, right? But that she showed up when her dad went missing. And then, finding out that he had, in fact, committed suicide, and she was the one who received that information and had to tell the rest of the family.
Barb did or Violet did?
It was the police officer talked with Barb, with Julia Roberts' character, and they went in and woke Violet up.
Yes.
In news. And
was that the one that she said she had gone to prom with?
Yes, that was the police officer, and he ended up ushering them to the scene where his body was found. They identified him. And then Karen comes into town with her, boyfriend, fiance, the day of the funeral. So she didn't come into town when she thought he was missing. They found out that he was dead. It was interesting dynamics that, Barb showed up in that moment for her dad. And mom, noticed and pointed that out. But also mom wanted Barb there. It was very clear that she wanted her there and felt some comfort in that. And Ivy was upset by that to some degree, as the, probably for good reason, as the primary caretaker for her parents.
Yeah, there's a part, maybe it's a little bit later, but where Violet tells Barb that she was her dad's favorite.
Yeah.
And when she said it, it sounded more like an accusation than it did a conversation.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's a part of that scene as well, where, oh, you're going to come home for him, but not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was interesting to me that Barb tried to resist, right? And I think she made a statement that she, would hope that, parents will love all their children equally, and, also that Violet mentioned that had she not gone away from home, had she not left, that, she felt like the suicide would never have happened.
Oh, yeah.
So that, speaks to the type of relationship that Violet believed those two had.
Yeah. That was a lot later in the movie. It kind of builds to that, to this, like, I guess fight that Violet and Barb have, where they just kind of like lay everything out there. I think it's interesting that, Violet talks about Barbara being her dad's favorite, and Barbara jumps to, well, I hope that a parent would love all their kids equally, but Barbara's only got one kid.
Yeah.
So I kind of wonder if that is she's never had to think about that as a parent. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that as a sister, one of three growing up, she probably thought about it. But from a different vantage point.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And it's interesting that the one kid that she does have, she doesn't get along very well with.
Yeah. Well, it seems like that, I'm going to forget his name too. Her and her husband, who's played by Ewan
Bill.
McGregor, Bill. Yeah. They're at least in the middle of a separation.
Yeah.
I think towards the end, they kind of confirm they're going to
Yeah.
move forward with a divorce, but they're in the middle of a separation. And I think at one point it's implied that is because he was unfaithful. And so I think I remember reading somewhere that it is not unusual for during a divorce, if there's a kid involved, for the kid to blame the parent who stays. So if they're, living with both parents and one parent moves out, it's not unusual for the kid to blame the one that remains behind.
Correct.
And it seems like that the daughter holds a lot of resentment towards Jean. Her name was Jean?
Barb.
No, the daughter.
Oh yeah, Jean. Yep.
Huh. That feels like an old name. Yeah, it seems like Jean holds a lot of resentment towards Barb.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting now that you say that, Jean and Bill clearly have, a lot in common. Like Barb made a comment when she wanted to come back after the funeral and watch the opera, right? And she, made a comment about, I bet you love that, or something, something along those lines. And so it seems like they were connected the very same way that Barb and her father were connected. And almost like that dynamic is replaying itself, because clearly Violet resented, or I think clearly that's an assumption, but it seems as if, Violet resented the relationship that Barb and Beverly have. And you see that playing out in Barb's own family.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So you've got kind of like this repeating family legacy. This really would be a good genogram.
Yeah.
To do. So I'm trying to think if I've talked about it much on the show before, and I'm struggling to remember, but let's talk about family systems for just a sec.
Yeah.
Just to kind of like give, because I don't ever want to assume that if we start throwing out therapy terms that everybody's going to be on the same page.
Yeah.
So tell me about your understanding, or maybe a brief understanding of what systems thinking is in family systems.
Typically when I'm trying to explain it, I just talk about how, in your family of origin, there's what's known as homeostasis, right? And it doesn't really matter how healthy or unhealthy that dynamic is. It's what's familiar and it's what's comfortable, right? And so we all kind of resort back and return to that family dynamic. And we see it replayed oftentimes as we go away and we create our own families. Much of those dynamics, it's try very much not to be like my mother, and I find the older that I get, the more like her I am, right?
Yeah.
Seeing those patterns kind of repeat themselves. And so when there's a shift in the homeostasis, right, the whole system kind of bucks, right? Because everyone is used to things being a certain way. And I find, especially in dealing with addiction, right, when the addict, who is the identified problem in the family, tries to gets better, right? You see that everything else in the family dynamic shifts because the homeostasis is no longer there. And so, working with people to try to adjust and figure out a way to adapt to that new homeostasis. But I think very much in the movie, you see everyone comes home, and it kind of just goes back to like the regular dynamic that I think that has always been there. And it's because it's what's comfortable and familiar, and it's what we know.
Yeah. I think that I've tried to explain to clients before. Each of us exists. If you think about it like a Venn diagram, we exist as a part of multiple systems. So we have our family of origin, your coworkers at work, that could be a system. Your friend group, if you're a part of a congregation at a church, that could be one. And every system that you're a part of is governed by a bunch of unwritten rules, and everybody has their role to play in the system. And what's so strange is for most of these systems, nobody got together and voted on the rules. Nobody has them written down somewhere and took a consensus to see if everybody wanted to abide by them. Mm-hmm. They just kind of manifested into existence, and each of us plays a role in the system. And there's all kinds of work out there where therapists and academics have named those roles. I mean, Virginia Satir is the first person I think of, where there's a lost child role, there's a mascot, there's a hero, and they each do a different thing. And then when we talk about that concept of homeostasis, like you were talking about, that just means that the system likes to maintain the status quo.
Yep.
It just likes to stay the same. And so whenever its sameness is disturbed, then the system fights back and it tries to correct itself. And I love that you went straight to addiction. That's where my work centers as well.
Okay.
And because I think that's just a tremendously powerful example of it. When a person struggles with addiction, most of the time, everybody in their system is used to them showing up in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And so when they show up in a different way, everybody else has to readjust, because they're used to so-and-so being a burden or being the person that they've always got to overfunction and correct for, or the center of attention because they're acting out or something like that. And then when they're not doing that, it kind of leaves a hole that other people can fall into. Not in the sense of that they're going to become addicts, but it causes people to confront themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Because so much of our existence and our identity is tied into however you've navigated that system, and that person's, the identified problem. And so, you really do have a shift in identity when someone in the family gets sober or clean.
Yeah.
That rescuer is no longer needs to be the rescuer. Well, and then who am I if I'm not rescuing you? It's can be really challenging stuff.
So do you think that there was a symptom bearer in this family? Like, was Beverly that kind of cornerstone person who, once he was gone, that kind of caused everybody to confront this? Like, who do you think filled that role here?
Yeah, I think you're right. So it was, Beverly obviously, struggling with his own addiction issues, but it sounds like, his addiction seemed to me at least to be more accepted by the family.
At least managed.
Yeah, than Violet's, right? And so, I think he was kind of managing Violet. You had the help of Ivy. Once Beverly was gone, and it's, okay, what are we going to do with Violet? And so now we have to have some real conversations where I think there was some sense of safety that the two of them had each other, even in their sickness.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so maybe it wasn't that he would have been the symptom bearer. Maybe it was that he was kind of the cork or the plug that was filling the hole to keep the ship from sinking.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I believe.
And then once he was gone, everything started falling to pieces.
Yeah. And of Violet being, the identified symptom bearer, which I think she probably was this whole time, right? Because even in them both struggling with addiction, it was Violet who tended to be, more angry and critical, and, where Bev seemed like he would just kind of go off and do his own thing. She was the one that was there interacting. And I think, they both seem to have a significant amount of trauma, right? But certainly Violet, the insight that we gained into how she was raised and her mother and those experiences, I think certainly contributed to her severe addiction issues. and that need to escape.
Yeah. I think one thing that's really interesting about this movie is, like you mentioned before, you do have this kind of generational passed down family legacy of addiction, of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
But as you go along, the movie also peels back layers on each character to really show how much more is going on behind their surface presentation.
Yeah.
And I think the most powerful example of that to me was Violet's sister, Maddie Faye, walks in, I want to say before Barb really ever does. Like she's kind of the first person that shows up at the house with her husband, and she's she just seems like she reminds me a lot of my aunt. She's very outgoing, very extroverted, very kind of bubbly, and as soon as she sees Jean, she wants to hug her and give me some sugar, and she's just kind of that, I don't know, kind of friendly glue that keeps the family together. And then a little bit later on, once they're all, I guess, settled at the house, her husband leaves to go get their son, Benedict Cumberbatch, little Charlie. Yeah. And then it's, as soon as he steps off a bus, he's just kind of an anxious ball of nerves.
Yeah.
And you find out that, and this would have been her cousin, that Ivy is like dating him.
Yeah.
Which they're first cousins. So that's a thing.
That's a thing.
That's a thing. But then you find out a little bit later that they're not first cousins. They're actually half brother and sister.
Yeah.
Because Beverly had an affair with Maddie Faye and she got pregnant.
And Violet knew about it.
So it's this like resentment that's been there for what I can only assume to be 40 some odd years.
Yeah.
And Violet's got resentment. Maddie Faye's got resentment. Ivy doesn't have resentment, but it seems like, and this might be a reach, that she was a duty-driven person, because I think she was the only sister who hadn't moved away.
Yep.
And it seemed like by her finding love with her cousin, that she was at the place where she was just like, come on, guys, let me have something. This is my one thing. It makes me happy. And then at one point, when Barb finds out from Maddie Faye, she tried to get Violet to tell Ivy, but Violet said, no, you got to do it.
Well, right. Well,
no, Maddie Faye says that.
Maddie Faye asked Barb to stop it.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell her to share what was there. So it was still keep the secret, you know, like stop it from happening whatever way you need to.
Yeah. And then the conversation is not meant to happen, but it just happens where Ivy and Barb and Violet are all at a table.
Yeah.
And it just kind of spills out, and Ivy is like devastated, I guess, as you would be if you found out that you were dating your half brother without you knowing. But that's another part of family systems, family secrets. Yeah. And in the kind of clinical sense, what that means is something in the family that everybody knows about and nobody talks about. And it's one of those unwritten rules, like everybody operates around it without really talking about what it is. And it seems like this family had a few of them, but that was a really, really big one.
That's a huge one. Yeah. You know, and I working with addiction and growing up that way myself, you know, it's like, that's the thing, you know, like that's the unspoken rules are the thing, you know, it's like, we don't talk about addiction, you know what I mean? you just figure out a way to kind of exist around it. Yeah, I think it was all very interesting. I think that, because even with looking at Violet and her behavior, the fact that she knew that was happening, she didn't say anything. She mentioned, as it related to Beverly, that she felt like that was a big reason why he drank the way that he did, because of the guilt that he experienced around little Charles. And so, she kind of held that, and I think in some ways maybe even tried to protect him, in some ways maybe, and that could be a stretch, but it's just interesting to me because I even saw this scene where they were sitting at the table together where she jumped in and told Ivy about them being, little Charles and Ivy being brother and sister. I almost saw that as her trying to in some way preserve the relationship that Barb and Ivy had by stepping in and being the bad guy, since that tends to be her role anyway.
Like uniting them by giving them something to fight against.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, not wanting, Ivy to resent Barb for being the one who delivered that information, which, it doesn't sound like it worked based on, as Ivy was leaving and kind of driving away and saying that there's not much difference between, Barb and her mother. But, it seemed to me like Violet was aware that it would be better for that information to come from her than from Barb.
Yeah. This movie's heavy. I mean,
yeah, so good.
I feel like we could like draw a diagram. I thought about doing this ahead of time. Just drawing a diagram of how these relationships kind of spider web off of each other.
Yeah.
Because you've also got like Barb's daughter, Jean, and Barb's sister, Karen. Karen is newly, I think, engaged to Steve. And Steve comes with Karen back to the house. It is new because the parents haven't met him yet. And they're like, who's Violet's like, who's this? He, at one point, they're out and about, smells pot on Jean and says, I got the good stuff. I'll get some to you back at the house. And late at night one night, the housekeeper, Jonna, sees or hears some people out in the yard and sees that it's Steve and Jean, and they're smoking pot. But then Steve starts to mess around with Jean. Yeah. And in what I think is my favorite part of the whole movie.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Jonna just like very calmly walks downstairs, grabs a shovel,
and pummels him with it.
And just starts swinging it at Steve. Yeah. And then I think, so in that moment, I really thought like, okay, so every other movie I've watched, here's what happens next. Other people come out and say, what is happening? And then the guy would have been like, I don't know, she's crazy. She came down here and started attacking me for nothing. And then they would fire the person. Every other movie. But in this one, when they come down, she just says, yeah, Steve was messing around with Jean, and I came down to stop it. And everybody just goes, yep, I accept that. That's definitely what was happening. And they run him off. Yeah. Well, they run him off, but like Karen took him back inside and they end up leaving. But I just thought, oh, cool. Well, that's somebody actually told the truth, and people, that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think that gave me insight because, they mentioned Karen and being in, multiple relationships and always having someone new in her life. But that sense of validation, right, that she needs from a partner, and being willing to, and it was obvious as she was leaving and becoming emotional as she was rationalizing and kind of justifying leaving with Steve, that she felt like she needed that relationship, even with his egregious behavior,
Yeah, she started to kind of blame it on Jean, and then she backed off. She was like, like most things in life, it's somewhere in the middle. And I'm not saying it was Jean, but I mean, Jean maybe had, she just kept bouncing back and forth between all the while she's kind of getting dressed and packing up and leaving.
Because she needed that man.
Yeah, I kind of thought, I wonder, since they said that I don't know if they said she'd been engaged a bunch of times, but I think Barbara at the very beginning says, this must be the new man of the year. I think something like that. Yeah. I kind of wondered if it was like a Enneagram 7. I don't want to engage with pain. So when things get tough, I go find a new fun kind of thing so that I don't have to sit with it.
Yeah. Hence her living in Florida, as far as, as far away from family as possible.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me.
So I'm trying to think of the other sisters. Ivy, Barbara, Karen, Maddie Faye was the aunt.
We talked about Barb some. Those were the 3 sisters. I think those are all the characters.
Yeah. So it really is kind of strange how Barb, having a contentious relationship with her mom, Violet, wanting to separate herself, and yet it ended up seeming like the other sisters thinking that she either became or already was very much the most similar to their mom.
Yeah.
Although in a different way, I would say, because they all see that their mom is high. They all see that she is pushes people away and has a tough time connecting. And it didn't seem that Barb had those things. It seemed like Barb had a good head on her shoulders, but maybe just overfunctioned.
Yeah, overfunction. She's the oldest, and so to some degree, it looks like we talked about family roles, right? Like she was maybe the hero. Which I think is always challenging for the younger siblings. I can identify with that as the oldest of 3. And so I think that underlying resentment that happens that isn't even a result of your own behavior, right? It's more about your parents' interactions with you and what that looks like in comparison to what it looks like, with your siblings possibly. And I would also imagine, that Barb being the oldest and her parents being addicts, that she had to take on more of a responsible kind of parenting role, the parentified child, and resentment too, and the only people she saw parent were her parents. So I would imagine that perhaps wasn't always the healthiest dynamic. And you can kind of see when she's interacting with Jean, and she gets upset with her and she smacks her across the face, that she's prone to anger very much like her mother.
Yeah. Although at that point, that could have been rage instead of anger. It could have been fear-based.
Absolutely.
And kind of lashing out. It's an interesting thing that you brought up, that her example of parenting was the only one she had was her parents, to see, how they parented her. And that's how things get handed down generationally through family systems, through a legacy, is without identifying and kind of intentionally working on things, we tend to repeat them in a family system. The maybe same type of relationship that Violet had with Barbara's developing with Jean. And I remember when my wife and I got married and we were going to we were going to premarital counseling. I was in grad school, so I was in the middle of studying this stuff. And so I was like, I want to go to somebody that does EFT, and I want to go to somebody that uses the Prepare Enrich. And which is an assessment used for marital and premarital counseling. But when we went to see our premarital therapist, we kind of started talking through the different areas of that the assessment outlines. And, we were coming in, I had already done 3 some odd years of therapy individually myself. My wife had done the same. So we felt like, we've done a lot of good personal work. We're not starting from scratch. But the assessment really pointed out stuff that neither of us had realized, our attitudes and beliefs about money.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that it pointed out that we were not surprised by, but that we had yet to talk about, it had this scale where it rated each of our family of origin's ability to pivot, I'll say. Basically, like, her family came out to be what it called rigid, and my family came out to be flexible. And so our therapist was like, what do you guys think about that? And it came out that way because her family, her parents are still together. They had a lot of family traditions growing up. They were very stable. And my parents got divorced. And so rigid wasn't really that kind of like negative connotation, but it was just, they had a lot of rituals that they repeated together.
Yeah.
And my family wasn't really flexible because I told our therapist, I was like, no, that's not right. Like, it wasn't flexible because we knew how to hold things loosely and change. It was flexible because every day was a hurricane and we had to learn how to dodge the debris or else we were gonna get knocked over. And she said, oh, so it's not flexible, it's chaotic. I was like, yes, that's the better example. And so it helped us really identify things that we were bringing into our marriage. And that is a great head start, because if you can't clock those things, if you don't see them just riding with you in the car, you don't have a really great shot at doing something different.
Right.
Because just like Barb only saw her parents parent, that is her idea of what a parent is. Better or worse, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So you got to be able to pull that stuff out and go, oh, is this something I want to take with me? Is it something I want to leave behind? How do I do something different?
Yeah. And I think there were no words that were put to it, but I think and maybe this is jumping ahead so we can pull back, but I think as Barb is leaving, right, her family home, that's almost the sense that I was able to get from her, and that there was some freedom. She's looking at the plains, and the wind is blowing. There's like this sense of, okay, like, I see it, right? I see that in some ways I have repeated this pattern, and also I'm walking away from this, hopefully in a place to do something different,
it's differentiation.
Sense that I experienced in that scene.
Yeah, it's differentiation.
Yeah, for sure. And then for me, as it relates, I wrote something down because it's something that I share working with addiction all the time, right? It's, you see that it's like, I think for me, the most healing thing for me in my relationship with my dad, who's an alcoholic, has been sober for 3 years. It was that when he shared his story with me, right? Which that Violet does, in bits and pieces throughout. It was obvious that some of the stories, when she's talking about the boots, right, on Christmas Day, that they hadn't heard that story before. And hearing my dad's story really gave me insight into what things were like for him and how far he really had truly come, as it related to raising me. It was less than ideal, but it was certainly better, than what he received from his parents. And, I think Violet was alluding to that when she was talking to Barb and talking about how hard their lives were. And then she goes on to say, but you went to high school and you had the opportunity to go to college, and, here's what our lives looked like, and really just trying to point out, I think from Violet's perspective, she felt like, she provided her kids with a vastly different experience than she got, and being able to feel okay about that. And I think I've experienced that with my own parents, feeling like they provided me with a different experience than what they had, and it was certainly better. And so, it now being my responsibility to do the work to kind of move on from that. So yeah, that always stands out to me, and just having this idea that like they did the best that they could, right?
And that's not to minimize their or your hurt from what you went through, but that's to say, I think that story that Violet told about the boots, I think that was trauma. Because it sounded to her that pair of boots that she wanted represented like hope. It represented connection with, I think she said she was in high school when that was.
Yeah, I think so.
But it was like a way of connecting with other people there, a way of like belonging. And then it sounded like she talked to her parents about it, and then they took that hope, that idea, and they warped it. They like mocked it, because the pair of boots they gave her were covered in mud. They were like work boots. They had crap all over them.
Yeah.
It was just.
Yeah. I mean,
like it was.
It was. Yeah. I mean, I felt emotional, like hearing her describe it, and so certainly trauma. And I think not only as it relates to that experience of connecting with others, but like she was believing that her mom, right, like cared about what she wanted, to do something kind for her. And I think that probably after that experience really shifted, what she believed about how her mom felt about her. Yeah.
And I one of the things that I do with my clients is when we go back into that family of origin stuff, and this might be something you do with yours too, both of us working with addiction. When you start to talk about that past trauma, what you find is, especially if it's in childhood, that the client, the person, because I think all of us have this a little bit, in their childhood, in the time they were going through it, created this like hardline rule, this vow, this kind of decree that would then go on to govern how they lived for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So they had some kind of trauma or some hurt from a parent, and they told themselves, well, I'm never going to let myself get hurt again. So I'm never going to let somebody get that close. And then 3 decades later, they're in our office going, I just don't understand why I can't develop close and healthy relationships.
Yeah.
And I think I've said this on the show before. I had this friend who conceptualized this in a way to me that I thought was so powerful as a part of his own story, and that I've used with clients since. He said, when I was 8, my dad hurt me, and I said, I'm never going to allow another person to get that close to hurt me again. And he said, in my adult life, I reached this place in every relationship where I look over at that 8-year-old kid and I say, what do I do? And that 8-year-old kid says, bail, don't let him in. And I listened to them. And he said, and at that point, I think he was 38. And he said, that doesn't make any sense for a 38-year-old to let an 8-year-old decide how he lives his life, but I do it every single day.
Yeah.
And I had never heard something like that before. And I just thought that is so powerful when we, as a child, conceived this way of this worldview and how we were going to live or govern our life. And we continued on with it, even though we are no longer a child.
Yeah. Yeah. So with my clients, when I'm talking about trauma, we do this exercise called the trauma egg. And
oh yeah.
From the trauma egg, and talking about the Murray method in general, which is kind of where it stems from. It talks about these 3 kind of parts. And that's what I really think about when you were sharing that is, you have your original child, right? We come into the world scathed, in touch with our natural talents, abilities, personalities, and then shit happens, right? And then this child is kind of developed from the pain that we've experienced through our life. And then we develop this controlling child, which is sole role is to protect that hurt part of ourselves, and it's like, that's the 8-year-old, like that 8-year-old part is the controlling child that says like, this is what we do to like protect you from that pool of pain. And and that we're always trying to work to integrate all of those parts together, knowing that they all have a place, but not letting one particular part kind of control everything that we do. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I had a session today and it was just a very similar experience. Mom was an addict, and it's, this need to constantly escape from allowing someone the opportunity to hurt you. And also finding that at some point that behavior no longer serves you and what you want for yourself.
Yeah. My therapist was a practitioner of the Murray method. And so I did my own trauma egg way back in the day. But I remember back then, her, and she did a very experiential thing where she had, 3 chairs, and then one of them was a little small teddy bear that was the wounded child. And then, the one on the other side was the survivor. And I think she had tried to find a really big teddy bear, but couldn't. She could only find a really big gorilla. So we just called it the gorilla bear. And then the chair in the middle was the healthy adult. And I remember saying, back then, hey, I don't identify at all with the survivor. I don't identify at all with the healthy adult. I identify a lot with the wounded child. And then her, pointing out to me, do you have a job? And I was like, yeah. She's like, you show up on time? I was like, yeah. She goes, you pay your taxes? I was like, yeah. She goes, that sounds really a healthy adult to me.
Right.
and it was this like pointing out, as you were saying, that all 3 are present.
Yeah.
Whether you can spot it or not, all 3 are present. And I think, as you're saying, learning that you don't have to let them decide who drives. And also there was a point where, like every good client in therapy does, and every good therapist, I guess, does, where I had to write letters to each one from the healthy adult. Yeah. And I remember saying to the survivor, listen, I'm alive because of you. Thank you for what you did in protecting me. But I am going to choose something different now. Yeah. And it wasn't, I remember being very intentional in that letter to not say, I don't need you anymore, or no, I don't like you, I don't want you, things like that. Because I needed that part of me for a long time.
Absolutely.
But as an adult, I could see that some of the things the survivor was doing was harming me. Yeah. And so I needed to say, thank you. Now I have other things I can choose, and I'm choosing them.
Yeah. I had a very similar experience. Mine showed up, manifested mainly as anger, right? Yeah, it was just having an appreciation for, having that to keep me protected when I needed it, and also recognizing that it was doing harm, that was in my life, and being able to hold space for that, but also saying, I have other tools now, that I can use to communicate, to set boundaries, to keep myself safe without having to always be angry and keeping people at bay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was looking at this year going out to Arizona to do Murray method training.
Oh man. Yeah, look, I think this is just the universe just reinforcing that.
Yeah. I mean, well, so the first one was in January that she was going to do, but I didn't find out the dates till it was like a week out, and I couldn't get the money together in time. And then we had a pandemic, so I don't know when the other
that
ones
little
are
thing.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, because I think we're at the time now where, I mean, we've been social distancing for something like since March. I mean, at least. Yeah. My countdown clock on my phone says the last time I was in office was 104 days ago.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's at this weird point now where this is kind of starting to feel not normal, but the norm. Yeah. So it is weird to kind of speak in terms of like, oh yeah, we have this global pandemic that's happening right now outside of our doors. And that is disruptive.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I love the Murray method. It's a tremendous tool.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where I didn't know that's what my therapist was using. I got years, probably 5 years out and in grad school, and I started reading about it. I was like, hold up, wait a minute. This seems familiar.
Right.
So is there anything else in the movie that you want to touch on?
Trying to think. I feel like we pretty much covered it. I think, and I don't know why I feel the urge to say this, but I think just at the end of the movie, as Violet is, kind of left sitting at the table before she goes to her caregiver, just the sense of empathy that I felt for her, so many things were getting in the way of her being able to be who she truly wanted to be, and we all have to figure out a way to set our boundaries in order to keep ourselves safe, and I think that all of the kids were doing that in their own way. But, it's clear she wants connection, she wants love. She wanted Barb to show up when she had cancer. She wanted that. And yet there was just so many things in the way, her trauma, her pain, her addiction, her anger. And so I think it just speaks to, it's like, think about if she, had gone to therapy, it's just like, and how different her life could have been. And so I cried at the end, and I'm a crier anyway, but it was just felt for her. And I think that empathy piece is, that's the biggest takeaway. If I can empathize with you, even if I don't approve, even if I don't agree, we get to heal in some ways from that, and having some understanding. And I definitely could understand her plight, for sure.
Well, what I thought was so interesting is whenever Barb left and Violet was left there by herself, the first thing she does is she puts on that Eric Clapton song, that record, and I think she grabs a drink, and she starts dancing, and she takes her wig off, and it seems in that moment that she's very happy. That she feels free, that she feels like, okay, things are where I want them. And then really quickly that changes. And all of a sudden she's calling up to Jonna upstairs. And then Jonna like meets her halfway down the stairs, and Violet just lays down in her arms like a baby. And it spoke to me in this, now that I finally got what I want, it's not what I want. That is just tremendously sad. And I think it really does point to that. When we can't be self-aware enough to examine what our motives are and why we want the things that we want, when we can't do that, what happens when we get those things? Is that really the end that we want to get to?
It's just good stuff.
I mean, it was a very powerful ending.
It speaks to, it's like when you talk about it being a family disease, addiction being a family disease, it's like, here it is, like on a platter. This is what it looks like, and just reinforcing, I think, the reality that everyone has to do their own work to heal from that dynamic, everybody does. And I'm hopeful that, everyone else was kind of, figuring out how they needed to do that. But I empathized with her for sure.
Well, let's shift just a little bit. I was wondering, can you tell me something that your clients have taught you?
I was thinking about that question, and I'm certain that it's so much, so it's so interesting to me that there's not like an immediate thing that pops out to me. But I think for the most part, it's like, I think about compassion, right? Like, it's so interesting. So I have had a history of being pretty hard on people, right? More in my personal life. And, clients can come in and it doesn't matter what they've been through, right? It doesn't matter what kind of trauma they've endured from certain people in their lives. There's this sense of like compassion and desire to like make things work, try to improve the dynamic. And, it's easy to help people do that as a therapist, but, it's a whole other thing to really practice it. And, I think the more people I've had come into my office that can just show that sense of compassion towards the people that they care about and the willingness to try to work on those relationships, it's helped me to grow and identify, you gotta just stop being so hard on people. You got to give people grace.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who doesn't give myself grace, right, that can translate over into not giving others grace. So that is something that I think
I would even wonder if that is the reason.
Yeah.
Because I know that like for most people, they would say it's easier to give others grace than it is to give myself grace.
Yeah.
But when you start with saying, I don't give myself grace at all, then I think you gotta wonder, is this set of standards that I'm holding myself to, am I also holding others to that same set of standards? And I know like in CBT, one of the negative cognitions, one of the thinking traps is should and must thinking.
Oh yeah.
Like focus on how other people should or must be. And it stems from this, like treating my own standards or preferences as rules.
Yep.
Like I'm just going to grab some stone tablets. I'm going to engrave these things for you guys real quick so that you can carry them with you to know how you're supposed to be.
Yeah. And when you don't live up to that, I'm super resentful.
Yeah.
Even though we didn't agree upon this, I've imposed it on you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That sounds like some family rules and some systems thinking.
Certainly.
Some unwritten stuff. So your clients are helping you to be more compassionate towards yourself?
Yes. And to others. And definitely others. Yeah.
Well, I think those things are intrinsically tied together.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right.
And I don't know if one of them comes first. I genuinely don't. But I do know that they add to each other.
Yeah.
Tell me, what's something that you're doing right now to take care of yourself?
So I enjoy nature. So one thing is hiking. That's really a spiritual experience for me. So that keeps me grounded, reminds me of, bigger purpose. So that's one thing. And then I have a 5-year-old niece that is local, my sister's daughter. And we are extremely close and we spend lots of time together. And again, she's just the innocence and the playfulness and the unconditional positive regard towards me. Also, I think keeps me really grounded.
Wow.
Those are like my 2 biggies, I would say. Hanging out.
That's cool.
Hiking. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's say that somebody was listening to our conversation today and they're thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, Jericha is fantastic. I think I could really connect with her. I'd love to become her client. How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways, but the easiest would be they could just go to my website, which is www.journeywithjericha.com. And Jericha is spelled Jericha. It's my contact information, my email and phone number are on the website, and it would also give them some ideas about the services that I offer.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well, Jericha, I can't even begin to tell you how much I've enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, this has been awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on. And, maybe next time give me a heads up about how intense the music's going to be. I don't know.
Well, now you know what to expect from me, right? Now you know what to expect from me.
Yeah. What's funny is like we used to at the beginning of doing the show, like my wife and I would like schedule out, some night to watch the movie ahead of time. But then as life has happened and as our, jobs have changed and all of that, sometimes just scheduling wise, I just got to watch it the day that I'm recording.
Yeah.
And there's been times where if the interview is earlier in the day, I watch it pretty early. Like I usually get up at 5:30 in the morning. So there's times where I'm starting that movie at like 5 or 5:30 in the morning. And there's been some movies, like specifically I'm thinking Rocket Man. And then I had a guest on last year who picked the movie Lion, which is so like
I sobbed and
oh my gosh,
sobbed.
ugly cry. Like put a bunch of syllables into ugly, and that's the kind of cry that I had. But like I'll get up and I'll start the movie, and Leanne will like just come walking down the stairs to get breakfast or wake up or whatever, and I'm sitting on the couch just sobbing. And she's been a couple times like, "Are you okay? Like what's going on? Are you?" And I'm like, "This movie." I got by without doing that on this one, but it's a different way. It's a different way to start your day. That's for sure. It's a different way to start your day.
For sure.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Can't wait to have you back on.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for joining me this week in the theater. I'll make sure I save a seat for you and a friend next week. Let's raise the lights, lower the curtain, and say that for this week, the theater is closed.